Dr. Van Dusen, thanks so much for giving us some of your time today. I'm hoping you can start off with our listeners kind of sharing a little bit about who you are and your background.
Yeah, pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me. My background began in Oregon as a high school physics teacher, and I loved that job. And sometimes I wonder why I ever left it because it was great. But I ended up taking an Einstein fellowship, Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellowship, where I went to Washington D.C. To work at the National Science Foundation, which is where I met Kevin, and we got to work together in the same, just across from each other, and really it was an eye-opening year. If I can recommend one thing to our educators out there, if you ever have the opportunity to apply to be an Einstein Fellow, it is really the most kind of amazing year you can spend professionally and personally. So did that for a year, was considering going back to my teaching job back in Oregon. But I decided, I think I might be able to make a bigger impact if I go and train future teachers and maybe have a chance to work on policy things. So I decided to go get my PhD in science education at CU Boulder. And from there, got my PhD and ended up going to Chico State in Northern California after that, where I worked in the science education department there for 5 years. And then just last year came over here to Iowa State. So it was my first stop in the Midwest, and it's been great working in the School of Education. I'm one of 4 science education faculty members, and just been really enjoying it here.
Outstanding. Am I right in remembering your dad was an academic? Am I correct in that?
So he was originally actually a K-12 teacher, and he ended up later in life working at a community college, teaching math, basic math. So like basics of addition and subtraction, fractions, stuff like that to community college. And he really thrived in that position. But so he's always been, involved me in science projects, coming up with science projects together, was installing the scale model of the solar system in our hometown, which I believe is still the largest completely 3-dimensional one in the United States. So it's 1 to 1 billion scale. So if you get a chance to check out the Eugene scale model of the solar system, that's a hoot. You can bike along all of it. And so doing stuff like that as a kid for sure help inspire me to be a scientist and to train future science educators.
So I think you're like the 4th Einstein Fellow I've met. Kevin, of course, being the first, and he likes to remind us all about it every time, So this is the first time that I've actually spoken with somebody who said, hey, I recommend people go out and do this. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and like what the requirements are for something like that for our listeners?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had no idea it existed. It's part of why I bring it up, because I didn't know it was a thing until I happened to be at a regional NSTA conference in Portland, Oregon, and they had a booth there. I was like, what is this? And ended up applying, and I didn't think anything would come of it, but then they flew me out for the interview and was accepted into a position. And the requirements are that you've taught for 5 years. I think it's high school or middle school science, I believe. And I think that's the only minimum requirement. Then it's your application and having, strong recommendations and strong letters, and you go out for the interview. And then if you're accepted, you're out there for a year working with a directorate or on Capitol Hill, and maybe you get lucky like Kevin, do 2-year stints. But it really is a life-changing, eye-opening opportunity for me. And went out there with my wife, and it was just a great opportunity for both of us, really. So
you were able to take your family with you. It wasn't like if somebody's already established that they wouldn't take, and they cover the cost of all of that.
Yeah. So you get enough to pay for housing and to be there. And come on over, Susie. Come over real quick and say hi. We got Susie, my daughter, wants to say hi here in her fairy outfit.
Hi, Susie. Look at you.
Wow, you look like your mom.
I love your outfit. This is Halloween outfit? Yeah. Oh, I love it. All right, go and close the door behind you. Right. So I think actually the benefits for the Einstein Fellowship have even improved since we were there. And my wife was able to. She's also an educator. She's a music education teacher, now a music ed PhD as well. But she came out and worked, and a lot of folks bring their kids with them. It depends. Some people, we didn't have kids yet at the time, but some kids saw it with them, and some kids had gone to college. And so it was a mix, and I think most spouses came, but not all. Kevin, Kevin did his stint. It's a lot of time in the gym and doing work.
I appreciate that. Let's transition a little. I'd like to know more, or would you share a little bit more about your PhD program at CU Boulder? And
yeah. So it was as an Einstein fellow. I knew that I loved education and I loved research. I'd done physics research, but I knew that wasn't my calling. It wasn't the thing I wanted to do. And then I found out that physics education research was a thing. And so you could actually research how we teach and learn physics. And as soon as I realized that, eyes opened, I said, that's the intersection where I sit. That's what I want to do. And so actually heard Carl Wyman, Nobel laureate in physics, give a talk at the National Academies where he talked about his research in this. And I was like, oh my gosh. And he's the one who opened my eyes. And I said, I want to come work with you. And he told me, well, you can't work with me where I am now, but go apply to CU Boulder. And so I did. Ended up in the School of Education there, working with Valerie Otero as my advisor. She's an amazing woman. And she guided me to where I am now. I got to do a lot of work with technology in low-income schools in the Denver area, and thinking about how we hook and motivate kids and what does that look like. And yeah, it was really, it's hard work for sure, but it was really enjoyable, and I learned a ton. And
So your Nobel Prize, the guy you really looked up to, Carl Wyman, wasn't he a professor at CU Boulder for a while?
So that's why he told me to go there. He had recently left there. He had joint appointment at CU Boulder and at University of British Columbia at the time. And so he said, well, go apply to CU Boulder. And I wasn't sure in the physics department or the School of Ed, and I'm going to the School of Ed, partly due to testing requirements. Now I know that at the time I had no idea really what the difference was, the implications of that decision. But I'm very happy, that I went through a school of education, because that's, I'm more of an educator than I am a physicist these days. I research how we learn physics, and so it was the right fit for me.
I actually have a question along that vein. I was pursuing my PhD. I wanted to go back and I wanted to teach teachers, right? And this was probably, gosh, it's been so long because I didn't finish, but it was during the time when in the state of Florida, we were being inundated as public school teachers with the idea that testing was going to be correlated to our paychecks. And it's really since, and I don't want to cite a particular governor, but during that time frame, things changed overall for the face of teaching. So much so that when I was taking a class on policy and I was seeing really what's coming down the wire, and this would have probably 15 years ago, I quit. And I just thought, I can't look a teacher in the face and say, and maybe it's just my state, and admittedly, Florida is an embarrassment when it comes to education overall, but I couldn't say, hey, you should go and become a teacher in the state. How have you been able to with policy, and how does that affect how you inspire teachers?
That's a good question. I mean, I was fortunate to be in a really positive teaching environment in my high school, and everywhere's got their struggles, and whether it's individuals or systems, but my experience was so positive. It's easy for me to bring that sense of joy, and and I see the students I have in my classes are just awesome. I've really been fortunate, and so think about sending them out there to hopefully make the change that I want to see, and to make those improvements, and hopefully we're chipping away at those things. And honestly, it's interesting in Iowa because I haven't taught in Iowa, and there's so much I don't know. I don't really know what our system is like here because I'm new. I haven't made the connections yet, and I'm just starting to do that. But it's I guess I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And I think if I've seen some really positive changes over here too. The way with NGSS and more, some people are implementing it kind of at a surface level or paying lip service, but then some teachers, I talked about all my students in their placements. I hear some their teachers are doing awesome, ambitious science teaching, really rich problem-based stuff. I'm like, oh, it's amazing that change has happened.
That maybe too, and where I'm coming from, an English background. So there has been a huge shift with the focus being more on STEM in the classroom. And so maybe that was just the issue at the time. So even from a federal level though, you probably are just dealing with the standards as you're saying. There's nothing.
Well, I mean, so the standards are based in this idea, right, of students should be involved in creating models and asking the questions that lead to, the development of these ideas. It really flipped around in the sense of hey, memorize all these factoids. It's, hey, learn to think like a scientist. And that's where my heart and interests are, and all the research is. And that's what I'm training my students to do. And I've seen that change. I didn't teach that way. I mean, I did a little bit of that, but I wasn't trained that way. I didn't know how to do that. And now I'm involved in the research side of it, and I've seen more and more evidence that more and more people are doing these things. There's more curriculums out there aligned with it, and I think that's a really positive change. Not to say we can't get more at the state and federal level and local level to support our schools. Absolutely, we need to continue to fight for that. But I don't know. I've seen some good things happen too over the years.
I totally. I wish I could tell you how much different things are now compared to when I knew you. I can't. First of all, I would have been a much better candidate for that fellowship now than I was 12 years ago.
No,
And
I totally understand.
Frankly, I think the open-ended question or the project, where I don't hardly do anything that doesn't require collaboration now, because
Right.
life is about working in groups and being able to articulate whatever it is you think and have it tested. Let the other kids, challenge what you say. I love when kids find mistakes in textbooks. I love when they find mistakes on my board, when I've written
Yeah.
something up. I never get offended by that. I'll give you a quick example, and you can tell me if there's a better way I could do it. I've got kids designing a space settlement. They want to put a depot between Earth and Mars. So I talked about Kepler's laws. I showed them some data on the Earth's orbit period and the Mars period. And I said, well, can you tell me about what would be the orbital speed or what would be the length of a year for a settlement that you placed somewhere out there? And what I wanted them to do is sort of interpolate data, right? If I gave them some data points, could they tell me what would be inside that set or just outside that set? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's great. I mean, right, you started with, this anchoring phenomena, this, thing that kids care about, like, oh, we've got this, we want to colonize Mars. They had their driving question is, we want to get a depot in between. So they've generated the question, and now you're helping provide some boundaries, some, questions to help them progress their thinking. But, you're doing all the right stuff there. Hopefully, it seems like they're going to be engaged. They're going to honestly think about this data. And so, they got real world data, all the better, which they can, work on developing models to think about that. And one of the tools I think about is like, it's some sort of, there's different simulations out there that might help them think about like, what should this orbit look like? But that sounds like you're doing the right stuff.
Yeah, I can't tell you. There's a couple of really great like ellipse simulations where you can change the focal points.
Yeah.
And you can change the size of the ellipse, and then you can look at eccentricity, period, velocity, things like that. Wonderful tools, such wonderful visuals at no cost.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Lasso. So as I was looking at your bio, what I found fascinating are two particular things: Lasso in general, how that's going to help the teachers, but also, and this will be a follow-up question or another one, the idea about the inequities that we see, particularly with people of color. I'm assuming is where we're going with that. I did a research paper recently on one of the things that we're presenting on, and it talked about the idea of science identity formation and how we think back to Vygotsky and Piaget and Erickson and all of those, the idea that kids can actually start to identify what they see themselves capable of doing so early as even kindergarten, right? So tell me a little bit about Lasso and how you're doing your research into solving some of those inequities in STEM.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lasso is, it's an online platform that came out of an NSF grant, and what it does is it hosts research-based assessments. We're not creating these assessments. Other researchers have spent a lot of time and effort developing assessments that can be, all the psychometric testing, and it can be used. The goal of these is to use them across a lot of contexts. And so you've got comparison data, you can use them for research and all this sort of stuff. And instructors can use them, say, oh, I changed something this year to do better than last year. Did my test scores improve? And these are generally meant to be given kind of the first week of class, get your baseline, and then the last week of class, see like how much did things change. And kind of one of the first and best well-known ones is like the force concept inventory, which looks at basically like Newton's laws, and so some core idea in a discipline. And now on Lasso, we've got over 70 of them now across the STEM disciplines that the instrument developers have agreed to have us host. And then they're free for instructors to come use. So it automates this process. So instructors aren't in their class taking half an hour to an hour of class during the first week and the same during the last week. They just assign it and do it at home. So they don't have to run the Scantrons, they don't have to know how to score it and analyze it and create plots. Automates all of that.
Favor big time.
Right. So hopefully, I mean, we now actually have a new tool that just went live this week where faculty could kind of be more interactive as they explore their data and look at issues of equity. It's our new equity analyzer. And so all that's free for instructors. And then then for the research side of things, is we take student responses and we anonymize them. All the students agree to, for these students that agree to share their data with researchers, we anonymize that. And then we have some course level information because the instructors told us some things about what they care about in their course. And we have student level information because students tell us some of their social identifiers. And then we have their test scores. And so we've got this large scale anonymized database, which we found to actually be more representative of typical college classrooms and what's in the literature. I mean, most of the literature says, okay, how do we help our underserved students? Well, you've got researchers at very prestigious institutions who have the time and resources to do that research, but their students are probably not representative of typical students who are under-resourced. And so, while I think it's fantastic that research is happening, that we need it to happen, we also need to see more diverse contexts, so that we can extrapolate from that data and generalize the findings to more contexts. So anyway, so there's this research database. It's available to researchers, but we also use it for our research. And because it is large and we're able to do things that are analyses that you couldn't do out of just like one classroom. We're able to disaggregate much further. So, most of the studies that have been done looking at disparities in student outcomes have looked at, for example, like white and Asian students versus everybody else, or men versus women. And they've looked at the differences in outcomes, the inequities there. But what we're doing is we're taking it and say, okay, we're going to disaggregate this a lot further. So we're going to look at, you're going to separate up Asian students, Hispanic students, Black students, white Hispanic students, who identify as both, and white students. And then we're going to look at men and women, and we're going to interact all these things. So we've got Black men, Black women, and a bunch of guys. And actually just now in our most recent one, we've also brought in first generation. So we've got this three-way interaction. So you've got first gen Black men, continuing generation Black men, first gen Black women, continuing generation. So we've got a lot of categories that we can start to look at and say, so where are the inequities occurring? And what do we see when they come into the class? And the way we refer to these are the educational debts that society owes these students. So if they come in with inequities, society has failed these students somewhere along the line. And we can point to a lot of places that might have happened. Okay, they're coming in with inequity, this educational debts. And the big question is, so then we teach them, what happens to those? Are they getting bigger? Are they getting smaller? Are they staying the same? Yeah. And one of the things we want to really push people on, sometimes say, hey, okay, like everybody gained the same amount. But if you came in with all those inequities and they left with the same amount, like for me personally, that's not a win, right? Like I just pushed them along and I didn't help close the gap, and we don't tend to use gap language in our research. We don't want it to be a deficit model, but like we haven't repaid any of that debt society owes these students.
Quick question. What percentage of your data is university student versus secondary student? And with your university students, do you have a lot of data about their background as far as what they had in high school? Because I'm thinking about, like a great school versus a very poor and under equipped school.